This is an ohm. Now, don't let the eyes or its titanic size fool you. They're friendly. At least, as long as you leave them alone. Otherwise, they get a bit stampede-y. The ohm are one of many giant insects that rule the post-apocalyptic world of Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. The bugs took over after humans had some spirited disagreements and wrecked the Earth, marginally faster than we're currently wrecking it. Now, on this channel, we love to answer the important questions. Some recent ones include, can you knit milk? How fast can you cook a hot dog if you use thermite? And of course, can animal cells survive being grown in Gatorade? But today we come to you with possibly our most important question yet. How big can bugs get? And are the giant insects of the toxic jungle even remotely possible? Currently, bugs come in a few standard sizes. Microscopic, itty-bitty, just a little guy, oh dear God, what is that? And of course, Australian. But if we look back in the fossil record, they didn't stop there. The largest dragonfly got to be about cat-sized, and the largest millipede got to 8 feet or 2.5 meters long. These days, the only arthropods that get that big live in the ocean. Both lobsters, crabs, and some shrimp can get to pretty monstrous proportions. And while I'm definitely counting them as bugs, we just don't see the same massive proportions on land these days. Well, except for coconut crabs. As is tradition, for every rule in biology, there is at least one exception. But even then, it's weird that that's the biggest we've got. The largest true insect is a beetle, and it only gets to be about as large as your palm. So today, first we're going to answer the question why we don't find Shelob-sized spiders or ohm-sized beetles. But once we understand the lack of giant bugs, we're going to tell evolution to kick rocks and do our best to create our own monstrously sized bugs using a chemical cocktail we've been experimenting with. We spent the last 6 months growing our critters, and it's finally time to show them off. So let's dive in and understand why we don't find crocodile-sized millipedes in our modern swamps. The answer that was given when I was in high school, you might have heard before. Most bugs don't have lungs, and instead breathe through special holes that run along the length of their body called spiracles. Bugs also don't have a circulatory system the way that we do with distinct veins and arteries. They're kind of more like a bag of blood, with a tube of open-ended heart in the middle acting as an impeller to keep it all mixed. So as long as some gas can exchange near the edges via the spiracles, it all gets mixed and they don't asphyxiate. The idea that is often presented is that because of this passive breathing, the extra oxygen during the age of giant bugs was what allowed them to get so large, and without that extra O2, they're physically limited. And while I'm sure that's a little true, this explanation doesn't actually hold up to literally any scrutiny. First of all, the spiracles are not just simple holes as they're often presented. They actually connect to a network of tubes and gas bladders, and as the insect moves, the squeezing and stretching of their bodies will actually draw quite a lot of gas in and through them, keeping them oxygenated. Further to this point, both spiders, scorpions, and their relatives also have what are called book lungs. They're modified from what were originally gills, but they work on the same basic concept as our lungs do. The book lungs are made out of layers of highly vascularized tissue that their version of blood, called hemolymph, is actively pumped through in the opposite direction that air flows. There aren't muscles to expand the layers like with our lungs, but the movement of their bodies and passive diffusion keeps fresh air moving through them. This way, there is way more surface area for oxygen to diffuse through. So, at a minimum, the makings of lungs were already there. Given time, there's no reason to say that proper lungs couldn't have evolved to compensate for an ever larger body, and lungs have evolved multiple times in Earth's history. But to address the oxygen content myth itself, while yes, the oxygen content was a bit higher than today, at about 35% compared to our current 20-ish, that's not that much more. And there was another period of tens of millions of years where the oxygen content got back up to about 30%, yet we don't see a return of giant insects. Instead, the answer is much simpler. There is a much more important feature of the world 300 million years ago when the age of giant insects was at its peak. There were no other animals on land. As the first animals to make it onto land, bugs enjoyed tens of millions of years being literally the only game in town, free to fill every size niche. But once our ancestors crawled out of the muck, everything changed. While it may have taken tetrapods a little while to get accustomed to being out of the water, they brought with them advantages that bugs just can't compete with. First, and probably most importantly, bones. The nice thing with bones is that you don't need to replace them every time you grow a little bigger. Instead, the soft, squishy bits can grow around a bone that itself just needs to get bigger. By far, the most dangerous point in a bug's life is during molting. During this process, bugs need to completely detach from the old exoskeleton, crack it open in the middle, and then shimmy their entire soft, squishy body out. The real problem, beyond this taking time, is that once they do get out, they're still soft and squishy. It takes hours for the new shell to start to form, and it's not fully hardened for potentially days. All the while, they have no defenses and are about as maximally edible as an animal can get. If we had to do this, it'd be like pooping out all of your bones once every few months or years, and then having to grow a whole new set repeatedly. Deeply unpleasant, and it would leave you very vulnerable. This process is also very wasteful. Each time they molt, the leftover shell has a lot of minerals and nutrients left in it that the bug is going to need to restock on. Even bony animals like deer or elk really struggle during horn growing season because of the intense nutrient drain. And that's just some head decoration. If you're replacing the equivalent to all of your bones regularly, you're going to be at a pretty serious disadvantage. And this is only made worse if you try and increase your amount of armor. Not only do you pack on extra mass, which can quickly restrict movement, you now shed even more mass every time you molt. At least when we put on clothing, we can reuse it. Imagine having to grow a new t-shirt and jeans every few days just to throw them out. That would be awful. But if you want an exoskeleton to show off your love of mad science, decorate your carapace with one of the amazing designs from our store. And since it's holiday season, we're having our biggest sale of the year. 20% off everything in store, be it t-shirts, mugs, DNA, ancient papyrus, or a new hat to protect your antenna. So don't miss out and head to thethought-emporium.ca to snag something before the sale is over. So, with an ever-growing population of dinosaurs and other giant reptiles, bugs started to have competition that they just couldn't win against. Even in the ocean, where bugs still get to be pretty big, they're still size limited. A lobster is technically immortal as far as anybody can tell, yet once they get past a certain size, the shedding process gets harder and harder. Eventually, what often kills them is that they fail to molt and are literally squeezed to death by their own growth inside their shell. So even under ideal conditions, the exoskeleton system is very limiting if you try and get too big, regardless of how you handle oxygen. And if we're talking about flying insects, they just can't compete with birds and bats. Birds are unbelievably efficient at air handling and can have huge talons and strong beaks that make any flying bug a target. They can also fly for days non-stop, and their much more advanced eyes and brains means that no bug is going to survive being huge and trying to share the air. So the logical and most energy-efficient solution would be to go the other direction. Rather than trying to outgrow your predators and become too large to eat like a hippo, instead, bugs needed to shrink in size. This makes for fast, nimble bodies that can much more easily evade predators, or small bodies that are easy to camouflage or fit into small nooks and crannies to hide. Throw in being able to breed faster than anything can eat your children, and what was beginning to look like a losing strategy suddenly becomes very successful. This is made easier because at small scales, bugs can get away with being as close to a minimum viable product that you're going to find in the animal kingdom. A fly, for example, starts its life as a wet noodle with 2 whole teeth to its name, and grows up to be an organism with a brain small enough to run on a laptop. But hot damn do they spread fast, making them very hard to get rid of. After all, the only rule of evolution is, to quote Astrid Lindbergh, you can't fuck if you're dead. As such, we find relatively small bugs on land. The final bit of evidence for this is that while the age of giant insects did have a few true giants, the vast majority in the fossil record were about the same size as insects today, even during periods of very high relative oxygen. And we do still have some today whose bodies get quite large. But as we've discussed, if literally anything else occupies the largest size niches, bugs get outcompeted. Now, it may seem a bit underwhelming to find that the reason bugs aren't bigger is because of evolution, but actually it's a good thing, at least for the sake of our mad science. It means that spiracles aren't actually the limiting factor, and theoretically we could have much larger bugs. So the world of Nausicaa is possible if we fuck up the planet in just the right way. But why wait for the apocalypse? What's the point of being a genetic engineer if I can't make monsters from time to time? So, how are we going to go about it? Well, first we need to understand how bugs actually control their size. You might think that the first thing we would try is adding more oxygen, but it turns out that that doesn't work. Other researchers have tried it multiple times, and while some bugs will get slightly larger, many actually get stressed out by the extra oxygen and end up smaller. Even highly robust bugs like cockroaches really don't like the extra oxygen, and this also lends more credence to what we talked about earlier. So if we want monster bugs, we need a different approach. Bugs, at least from a hormone perspective, work basically the exact opposite way that we do. We have a growth hormone that so long as the level is high, we get bigger. Bugs, on the other hand, have what's called juvenile hormone. As we've talked about, bugs constantly have to shed their exoskeleton as they grow, but most times that they shed, they go from one larval stage to a slightly larger larval stage, and this is controlled by keeping the levels of juvenile hormone high. When the level of juvenile hormone drops once they've hit max size, the next time they molt, instead of staying as a larva, they'll instead pupate. Pupation is how land bugs mature into adults. Unlike us, with puberty being a slow, drawn-out process, bugs get it all out of the way in one go. First forming a shell around themselves, before basically turning into sludge on the inside and completely rebuilding their bodies into the adult form. I'll be honest, it sounds worse than acne in a cracked voice, so I'm pretty glad we don't do this either. In the ocean, and in other arthropods that don't do pupation, there's more variation in how maturity happens. Some do it gradually with each molt, others will change dramatically between molts, just like pupating insects. But regardless, they still use the same hormone system and basic life cycle and body plan, which is also why I've been counting things like crabs as bugs. In principle, anything we learn from true insects is also applicable to the rest of the bugs. Anyway, the most obvious question then is, well, what happens if juvenile hormone levels never drop? Do the bugs just keep getting bigger? Or do they have some other way to monitor their size? Well, there's only one way to find out. We ordered a variety of different bugs to test on from a local reptile supply place. While my adorable pet noodle, Linguini, doesn't eat bugs, lots of other reptiles do, and so pet stores carry a variety of insects to keep them fed. We got silkworms, hornworms, mealworms, and flightless fruit flies, and since they can't fly, we've taken to calling them fruit walkers. Now, how can we control the level of juvenile hormone? Well, it just so happens that humans, clever little monkeys that they are, figured out that there's a whole family of chemicals called insect growth regulators. Some of these will trigger the same receptor as juvenile hormone, and in some countries they're used as a pesticide. If you overload the receptor, the insect just dies, and since no other animal uses juvenile hormone, it's pretty much harmless to them. If instead of just ramming them full of the stuff, if we dose their food with a tiny controlled amount, we should be able to find a sweet spot where they get stuck in a growth loop. At least, that's the hope. So let's drug some bugs.
Walter, what are you doing?
I'm dosing a caterpillar.
Dosing? As in LSD?
Well, it's a special blend.
I see. Hey, guess what just happened? Finding out that my father's giving drugs to bugs somehow just became a typical moment in my life.
It's wonderful, isn't it?
We bought a chemical called piproxafen, which is a juvenile hormone mimic. There were a few to pick from, but this one was the most potent and has the benefit of sounding like the kind of mad science chemical that would make bugs big. Anyway, we had to mix up food for each of the different bug types. The hornworms get hornworm chow, which is a horrible beige mush. The silkworms get silkworm chow, which is a horrible green mush. And the fruit walkers get fruit walker chow, which is again a beige mush that somehow smells both better and worse than the other various mushes. Finally, the mealworms get wheat germ, though they also need a source of water, so we're using these water crystals, which, as far as we can tell, are some sort of sodium polyacrylate, which is the same stuff they use to make Orbeez. We had initially experimented with supplementing some of their diet with fresh veggies, but we pretty quickly realized that this would mess with the amount of drugs that individual bugs were getting. So we switched to just dosing the chow or the water crystals in the case of the mealworms. Our first test is to see what concentration of drug the various bugs respond to. So we made multiple tests with increasing drug content, ranging from 2 milligrams all the way up to 60 milligrams. And it did not take long to see results. At the highest doses, the bugs just died. This was to be expected, after all, this stuff is a pesticide. And at the lowest doses, there wasn't enough drug, as the bugs still pupated, many of which became healthy adults. But near the middle, we hit gold. Around 15 milligrams per 50 grams of food was enough to almost completely inhibit pupation, and the bugs started to get big, though the response varied across species. The mealworms were by far the most resistant to the drug and the most responsive. They could handle very high concentrations, but even at low concentrations, it was enough to stop them pupating. And from there, they just kept growing, so we'll come back to them in a minute. The two caterpillar species, the hornworms and silkworms, seem to handle the drug similarly. While they're dosed, the bugs will grow to what is basically the maximum normal size. But then they stop growing. And if they aren't allowed to pupate at that point, they get sick and then die. But if you switch out the food for undosed food, eventually the drug clears their system and they pupate and become adults. And can we just take a second to admire how ridiculously cute silkworm moths are? Just look at those big puppy eyes. Don't you just want a giant one to snuggle with? Anyway, the fruit walkers had a similar fate to the caterpillars. The drug will stop them becoming adults, but not pupating, interestingly enough. So the walls of the container get covered in pupa that all just die. Which is kind of a bummer. I was really kind of hoping for a thumb-sized fruit fly, but we'll get there one day. So while this didn't produce giant insects in most of the bugs, it does show that if you raise these bugs, you can guarantee they get to max size every time by using this drug, which is neat, but not what we were going for. However, returning to the mealworms, they just kept getting bigger and bigger. Mealworms are a species of beetle, and unlike the caterpillars and flies, they don't have a set number of molts. The caterpillars will molt exactly 5 times every single time, whereas the beetle larva can molt anywhere between 12 and 20 odd times. And they'll pupate when conditions are most ideal, rather than at a specific growth size. So while the caterpillars capped out, the larva just got huge. Here is a normal mealworm. But now here is our drugged one. What an absolute unit! And these fat boys would make for great lizard treats. There is a related species of beetle called a superworm that normally looks huge compared to a mealworm, but compared to our monsters, there's almost no difference. That said, since we had some superworms for doing this comparison, we decided to try drugging them too, and again we had great results. They got noticeably bigger, but also interestingly their shells became much darker, which looks cool, but also look how freaking huge they are! One of the reasons we started this project was because you can actually already buy what are called giant mealworms. Here's some that we bought, and they're made the same way that we showed, by drugging the bugs. On average, the store-bought giants were ever so slightly smaller than ours, but we did find the occasional huge big boy in that batch. So at least our results are pretty consistent with theirs. Once these have reached this giant size, if you stop feeding them the drug, they still do go on to pupate and form healthy adults, which is nice to see. But we were not satisfied to stop there. What was apparent was that even though juvenile hormone prevents pupation and does allow for some extra molts in certain insects, there is some sort of extra internal timer that is counting directly the number of molts, and acts as a secondary inhibitor of growth. This means that there's a second circuit that we need to unlock if we want to achieve further growth. So let's quickly return to talking about how molting works. While juvenile hormone controls if pupation happens, there's another hormone called ecdysone that controls when each molt happens. Both of these hormones are released by special neurons in the bug's brain, and where juvenile hormone comes as a fairly static level until it drops off, ecdysone comes in sharp pulses. When a pulse comes, it triggers the molt, and so long as juvenile hormone is high, that molt will end as a new, larger larva. Our hope was that if we provide just enough ecdysone at the same time as the juvenile hormone, we might be able to exceed the limit. We got the idea from a paper that showed that applying ecdysone to hornworms right after their 5th molt while juvenile hormone levels are high trigger a 6th molt and much larger larva than usual. But where do we get ecdysone? Well, it turns out the answer comes from none other than Popeye the Sailor Man. You see, plants, while they may not be great conversationalists, are very clever. Many plants have evolved to produce what are called phytoecdysone, which really just means they figured out how to produce ecdysone. This way, any bug that eats that plant gets swamped with molting hormone, triggering a bad molt that kills them. And wouldn't you know, one of the most potent sources of phytoecdysone is spinach. And while humans don't have an ecdysone receptor, ecdysone does interact with a different receptor that we have called estrogen receptor beta. Now, it's tempting to assume that because estrogen is involved, that it's something to do with the sex hormone. But no, it actually isn't a sex-related gene at all. Instead, it actually controls muscle growth, and stimulating the receptor can induce muscle hypertrophy. As such, you can buy pills pre-filled with ecdysone online, and bodybuilders take them to help them get swole, which does technically mean that Popeye was onto something. Anyway, we had hoped that by adding ecdysone directly to the feed, we could get lucky and hit another sweet spot that fully unlocks the growth. And at first, it seemed like it might be working, but then tragedy. The hornworms all died. Both the highest and lowest concentration had killed them pretty quickly, leaving only the middle concentration to survive the longest. But even they didn't survive long. The mealworms fared a little better, but we started to notice more and more of them dying. And after a few weeks of treatment, when we weighed them, we actually saw that increasing ecdysone only led to a loss of weight, not gain. So if we want bigger, we're going to need a different approach. Feeding them the ecdysone directly is just too blunt of an instrument to interface with the delicate bug circuitry. Either we somehow need to control more carefully the feeding schedule, or a completely different delivery mechanism than food. We're thinking maybe a timed aerosol or something like that. But all of this was only ever a proof of concept. To make Mothra, we shouldn't be relying on this blunt tool and should really be going in and directly tinkering with the DNA. Either by giving us optical control of the release of the hormones so we can trigger it by just applying the correct color of light, or adjusting the timing and sensing circuits directly. Unfortunately, that'll have to be for a future video, but I'm still thrilled at how chonktacular we managed to get the beetles. I suspect this method would work with Hercules beetles, which are the world's largest, so we might get a few larvae to see if we can make a world record-sized bug in the future. And I'd be very keen to try this on crustaceans. It might even be worth redoing the experiment with some isopods or crabs. Now, most of my world domination schemes require growing giant insects or finishing our meat robot. You know, maybe a death ray on the moon, or sharks with friggin' lasers. But there have been far crazier real people who have grabbed power throughout human history, and they were as eccentric as they were horrible. Most often, these sorts of kings, dictators, and presidents for life arise at critical points where the rule of law is being tested, and where they walk, no law follows, leaving only raw, unchecked power free to do whatever evil they please. They're the sort of real monsters that would just as quickly feed you to literal crocodiles as they would be to give you a ridiculous military award for doing nothing. From gold-plated assault rifles and lives of luxury to being tortured just for losing a sporting event. Learn all about the most bizarre and brutal dictators of the modern era in Real Life Lore's exclusive new series, Mad Kings, available only on Nebula. Speaking of which, if you've never heard of Nebula before, it's the amazing streaming service that we're very proud to be part of. It's an independent platform that is completely free of ads, where you can see our videos and the videos of so many of your favorite creators that I'd need another few minutes of runtime just to list them all. It's the biggest collection of smart content on the internet that is also just plain fun. And not only do you get all of our regular content early and ad-free, there is so much bonus content there too. We recently posted a bonus video deep diving in how you write DNA code and order plasmids for making our genetic monstrosities. And on top of that, there's a growing collection of amazing Nebula originals like Mad Kings, with new shows and series being added all the time. And as an added bonus, a yearly subscription is currently 50% off at only $30 a year. That works out to only $2.50 a month. And if you're unsure if Nebula is for you, they now offer a 3-day free trial. Give the full 3 days a try and see how much nicer the ad-free experience is, and explore all the amazing content that's on offer. And when you love it, sign up with our link. Special thanks to all our existing Nebula subscribers, and for everyone else, hope to see you there soon. That's all for now, and we'll see you next time.